Welcome to another deep dive. You know I love getting these textbooks from you, and today's looks like a good one.
Oh, yeah.
Biochemistry. I always loved this stuff in school.
A classic.
A classic for sure, but maybe a little dense for some folks out there.
You think so?
Maybe just a little bit.
Well, hopefully we can break it down into some
Yeah,
manageable pieces.
exactly. Today's deep dive is all about thermodynamics and how it relates to all these amazing biochemical processes.
Right, and not just the complicated stuff. I think we can connect it back to some everyday examples as well.
For sure. So the first law of thermodynamics, this is the one that says energy can't be created or destroyed, only transformed.
Yep, the universe's energy budget always has to be balanced.
Like a giant cosmic accountant keeping everything in check.
Exactly. And these transformations are happening all the time, all around us. Think about something like cooking.
Okay.
You're using the chemical energy, natural gas,
Right.
to transform it into heat, which then cooks your food.
Makes sense.
But before we go too much further, I think it's important to define what we mean by a system
Right. A system.
in thermodynamics. It's basically just whatever we're choosing to study at that moment.
It's like drawing a boundary around something.
Exactly. And there are different types of systems depending on what can cross that boundary.
Okay.
You have an open system, which can exchange both matter and energy with its surroundings.
So like a living organism.
Exactly. A living organism is constantly exchanging matter and energy with its environment, taking in food and oxygen.
And releasing carbon dioxide and heat and other waste products.
Right. Now, a closed system can only exchange energy with its surroundings.
Okay, so like a sealed container.
Exactly. And then there are isolated systems, which exchange neither matter nor energy.
So like a perfect thermos that keeps your coffee hot forever.
Well, no real thermos is perfectly isolated, but that's the idea.
Right. It's theoretical.
Yeah. So going back to that energy accounting idea, the textbook says that the change in a system's energy is equal to the heat it absorbs minus the work it does.
So if a system absorbs more heat than the work it does, its energy increases.
Right. And if it does more work than it absorbs heat, its energy decreases.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, the textbook also mentions this idea of state functions.
Ah, yes.
And I have to admit, this one always tripped me up a little bit back in school.
It can be a little tricky, but think of it like your altitude on a mountain.
Okay.
Doesn't matter how you got to that altitude.
Whether you hiked or took a cable car.
Exactly, or parachuted in.
Right.
Your altitude, that state function, is the same.
So it only depends on the current state, not on how it got there.
Precisely. And in thermodynamics, both energy and enthalpy are examples of state functions.
Okay, and enthalpy, that's basically like the heat content of a system, right?
Pretty much, yes. It's particularly useful because most of the systems we deal with in biology are under constant pressure.
Right, so like atmospheric pressure. Okay, so if we know the enthalpy change for a reaction, we know how much heat was released or absorbed.
Regardless of all the little steps in between.
So we don't need to track every single tiny detail.
Exactly. And that's what makes state functions so useful. We can study these really complex processes like glucose metabolism.
Right.
Without having to measure every single step.
So it simplifies things.
Massively, yeah.
That's awesome. All right, now let's move on to the second law of thermodynamics.
Oh, and everybody always remembers.
The one about entropy, right?
Right. It's the idea that everything in the universe is moving towards disorder.
Like my desk after a long day of work.
Well, exactly. Think about a deck of cards.
Okay.
If you start with a brand new deck, they're all perfectly ordered.
Right.
But then you shuffle them, and that perfect order is gone.
It's all random.
Right. You've increased the entropy, the disorder of the system.
Okay, that makes sense. And the textbook gives this example of two bulbs connected together, one with gas and one empty.
Oh, yeah. Classic.
When you open the valve between them, the gas molecules spontaneously spread out.
To maximize the disorder.
Exactly.
And it's this drive towards disorder that makes a lot of things happen spontaneously.
Okay, so how does that apply to, like, living things?
Well, think about how oxygen travels from your lungs to the rest of your body.
Okay.
In your lungs, the oxygen is more concentrated.
Right.
And then it moves into your tissues where there's less oxygen.
It's spreading out, moving from order to disorder.
Exactly. Increasing entropy.
So this explains why things naturally tend to mix and spread out.
It does. But it's not just about things getting messy. It's also a key part of how proteins fold into their specific shapes.
Wait, how does disorder lead to those complex protein structures?
That's a great question. It turns out that while some interactions within the protein actually decrease entropy locally,
Okay.
they actually end up increasing the entropy of the surrounding water molecule.
Feels like a balancing act.
Exactly. You've got these different forces at play.
And the final folded protein represents the state with the lowest overall free energy.
Right. And speaking of free energy, that's what we really need to look at to figure out if a process will happen spontaneously or not.
So we've got these basic laws of thermodynamics, entropy, free energy, all that good stuff. But I'm really curious to see how this all plays out in these really complex processes happening inside cells, like protein folding, for example.
Okay. Yeah.
How do these long chains of amino acids manage to fold into these precise 3D structures? It seems kind of counterintuitive.
Right. So you've got this long chain of amino acids, right? Imagine it's like
Like beads on a string.
yeah, beads on a string, and they're all bumping and wiggling around in this watery environment.
And they're trying to maximize entropy, like those gas molecules?
Exactly. But here's the interesting part. Some of the interactions between those amino acids can actually decrease entropy locally.
Okay.
For instance, you have these hydrophobic amino acids.
The ones that don't like water.
Right, exactly. And they tend to clump together, kind of like they're trying to hide from all the water molecules.
Like little introverts avoiding a party.
Yeah, I like that. And this clumping, while it decreases entropy in that little spot, it actually increases the entropy of the surrounding water molecules.
How so?
Well, they now have more space to move around, more freedom.
So it's a trade-off. The protein gets more ordered, but the water gets more disordered.
Precisely. And the final folded state of the protein represents that perfect compromise, the point where the overall free energy of the whole system is minimized.
That makes sense. Now, the textbook mentions that the free energy change for protein folding is usually negative, so it happens spontaneously.
Right.
But how does temperature play into this whole process?
That's a good question. Remember how free energy has that enthalpy component and that entropy component? And that at higher temperatures, the entropy becomes more important.
Yeah.
Well, if you heat a protein up too much, that increase in entropy can actually overcome the forces holding the protein together.
So it unfolds.
Exactly. It loses that precise structure.
So it's kind of like if you heat up an ice sculpture,
Yeah.
the ice melts and you lose all that intricate detail.
Perfect analogy. And this principle of temperature affecting that balance between enthalpy and entropy, it applies to way more than just proteins.
Right. It affects lots of biochemical processes.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit and talk about metabolic pathways, those intricate series of reactions that break down and build up molecules in cells.
Okay.
How does thermodynamics fit into all of that?
So every single step in a metabolic pathway, there's a change in free energy.
For sure.
Right.
Okay.
And for that whole pathway to work, to actually proceed, the sum of all those changes has to be negative.
So even if some steps require energy, overall it still has to be downhill.
Exactly. And that's where our friend coupled reactions comes in. A step that needs energy, an endergonic step, can be coupled to a reaction that releases energy.
Like ATP hydrolysis.
Yeah. ATP hydrolysis is a great example. It provides that extra push to get things moving.
So it's like one wrestler giving their partner a boost to pull off a big move.
Yeah. And the breakdown of glucose glycolysis is a perfect example. Early on, you need energy to add a phosphate group to glucose.
Okay.
And that's coupled to ATP hydrolysis, which provides that necessary energy.
So it's like ATP is that strong wrestler powering things up.
That's a great way to put it. And that investment pays off later on when you actually generate more ATP through those exergonic reactions in glycolysis.
It's like a clever energy recycling system.
Exactly. Now think about building glucose from scratch. That's gluconeogenesis.
Okay.
And that's actually energetically uphill.
Makes sense.
So you need energy input from ATP hydrolysis and other molecules to push those endergonic reactions forward.
It's like those roller coasters that have to be pulled up to the top of the hill.
Exactly. It highlights how versatile thermodynamics is, explaining how cells can break down molecules and build them back up.
So cool. But the textbook also points out that thermodynamics just tells us if a reaction will happen spontaneously, not how fast it will happen.
Right. Yeah.
So how do we factor in that speed, the rate of these reactions?
Well, that's where enzymes come in. They're like the catalysts that speed things up.
Okay, how so?
By lowering the activation energy, the energy need to get the reaction started.
So it's like making it easier to get that ball rolling.
Exactly. Imagine you're trying to push a boulder uphill. It takes a lot of effort to get it moving.
Right, so you need to clear the path.
Yeah. That's what enzymes do. They smooth out the path for the reaction to happen.
Okay, so they're like trailblazers, making it easier for the reaction to proceed.
Exactly. And here's the key point. Enzymes don't actually change the overall free energy of the reaction.
They just help it reach equilibrium faster.
Exactly. So they're like efficient traffic controllers, keeping things moving smoothly.
I like that. So why are enzymes so important for life?
Because they allow those reactions to happen at a speed that's actually compatible with life.
Okay.
If we didn't have enzymes, a lot of those processes would be way too slow.
So it's all about efficiency. This has been really eye-opening, seeing how these thermodynamic principles actually drive these amazing processes of life. Protein folding, metabolic pathways, it's all connected.
Yeah, it is. And we've seen how enzymes are crucial for speeding up these reactions and making life possible. But there's one more really important piece to this puzzle.
Okay.
The power of coupled reactions and the molecule that makes it all happen, ATP.
All right, let's talk ATP. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground, entropy and enthalpy and free energy, even those coupled reactions. Now it's time to talk about this ATP.
Yeah.
It seems like this is really the key to understanding how energy works in living things.
Absolutely. ATP, or adenosine triphosphate, it's like the energy currency of the cell.
The currency.
Yeah, it's involved in pretty much every process that needs energy, muscle contraction, nerve impulses, building those big complex molecules.
Transporting stuff across cell membranes.
Everything. You name it, ATP is probably involved.
Wow. So it's like the fuel that powers all those cellular machines.
That's a great way to put it.
But how does it actually work? What makes ATP so special?
When it all comes down to the bonds between those phosphate groups in the ATP molecule.
Okay.
When one of those bonds is broken, it releases a burst of energy. And that process is called hydrolysis.
Hydrolysis.
Right. And that turns ATP into ADP, adenosine diphosphate, and inorganic phosphate.
Okay.
And that reaction is highly exergonic.
So that means it has a negative free energy change.
Exactly. Spontaneous, like a ball rolling downhill.
And that downhill roll releases energy.
Which the cell can then use to power other things.
Okay, that makes sense. But how is that energy actually harnessed, to do useful work in the cell?
Well, that's where our friend coupled reactions comes back into play.
Right.
Remember how we talk about how a favorable reaction can drive an unfavorable one?
Yeah.
Well, ATP hydrolysis is often directly coupled to those energy-requiring processes.
So it's like ATP is bringing those little packets of energy to wherever they're needed in the cell.
Exactly. A dedicated energy delivery service.
I like that. Can you give me like a specific example?
Sure. Think about the sodium-potassium pump.
Okay.
It sits in the cell membrane, pumps sodium ions out of the cell and potassium ions in.
And that's important for a lot of things.
It's essential for nerve function, for muscle contraction, all sorts of things.
But it takes energy to move those ions against their concentration gradients, right?
Right. It's like trying to push a crowd of people through a narrow door.
Yeah, it takes effort.
And that effort comes from ATP hydrolysis.
Okay.
The pump actually binds to ATP, and when that phosphate bond is broken, that energy is used to change the pump's shape.
So it's like using the energy from ATP to power a tiny molecular machine.
Exactly. And this is happening all over the cell. ATP hydrolysis is powering muscle contraction, protein synthesis, even those little molecular motors that transport things around inside the cell.
It's amazing how one molecule can do so much. But if ATP is always being used up, how do our cells make sure they have enough?
Another great question. That's where those metabolic pathways we were talking about come in. Breaking down glucose. That's a major way to recharge the ATP supply.
Through glycolysis and cellular respiration.
Exactly. And you can also get ATP from breaking down fats and proteins.
So it's like this interconnected web of reactions all working to keep the energy flowing.
It really is. And thermodynamics gives us that framework to understand how all these processes are regulated and how energy is moving around.
This whole deep dive into thermodynamics has been incredible. It's amazing to see how these seemingly abstract concepts actually play out in the real world, in the processes of life.
Yeah.
Protein folding, those metabolic pathways, the power of ATP, it's all connected.
And it's all thanks to those fundamental principles of thermodynamics.
The same principles that govern everything from simple ice cube melting,
right,
to the most complex biochemical reactions.
Exactly.
It's really mind-blowing.
It is. It shows the elegance of nature and how those discoveries from centuries ago are still helping us understand the very essence of life today.
Well, I definitely have a newfound appreciation for ATP, that tiny little power pack that keeps everything going.
That's what we're here for.
Well, mission accomplished. I feel like I've learned so much today. Thanks for joining me for another deep dive.
Anytime. It was fun. Keep exploring.